Great. So welcome everyone to our introduction to Vicarious Trauma for Frontline Workers. This webinar will be divided into two mini-series. My name is Kayla Breelove Carter. I'm a licensed counseling therapist, a clinical traumatologist, and a clinical supervisor for the community counseling program in Moncton. I'm really looking forward in offering you this webinar tonight. I would like to start us off by sharing with you what it is that we do here at Breelove Counselling. Using a trauma-informed approach, we operate an integrative practice focused on community and private partnerships. Our specialty ranges from general mental health, art therapy, adversities, trauma, to nutritional psychology for individuals age 18 and older. Our focus is to help individuals build resilience and heal. We achieve this by exploring opportunities for wellness, empowerment, non-judgmental listening, and customized treatment plans. Our focus is also a central part of our commitment to working with first responders, including healthcare workers and frontline workers alike, in bringing an awareness and practice of vicarious resilience to help manage vicarious trauma and building trauma-informed organizations. Breelove Counselling contributes to the efforts of a resilient community. Since 2012, we focus on services that support and empower wellness, awareness, and resilience. Our community contribution is through our practicum placement program, the community counseling program, in partnership with the Canadian Mental Health Association of New Brunswick Moncton office. This program offers free counseling therapy for those in need, including our counseling clinic, to which we've been made available through video, telephone, and messaging during this pandemic. So the goal of these webinars, or the two-part webinar series, is to increase your awareness of the impact of your own experiences, the development of trauma, the process of vicarious trauma, recognizing the signs of vicarious trauma, as well as learning strategies to help address vicarious trauma. Our experiences play a significant role in how we navigate adversities, from stress to toxic stress, whether unexpected or for some, chronic. There are three parts to consider when understanding the experience influencing whether something becomes a stressful experience or a toxic experience. So when we start with the prefrontal cortex, so that's the front of the frontal lobe in the front of the brain area, this is like a vacuum. It picks up everything that it's in its path. Some stuff we might not even realize because there's so little, or in our case, that we're not consciously aware of in that moment. So this means our sight, our smell, our taste, our hearing, and our feel. We are consciously aware about 5 to 10%. The other 90% is subconscious, but that doesn't mean we aren't processing what we take in within that 90%. What actually happens is that it all gets processed in what we call the hippocampus. And this part helps us store and remember information. So it's sort of like a librarian. The experiences are books, and the librarian sorts and puts away those books. When put away, they sit on, let's say, like a bookcase. The back of that bookcase is like a giant button, and it sends the message to our amygdala. So our amygdala is like the conductor of an orchestra. It's a part of the brain which communicates to the rest of your body how to respond to that information. Some information gets processed and stored pretty well. Others may end up overwhelming the librarian and is unable to be stored. In that case, the book is kept on the librarian's desk, and the librarian pushes the button under the table, so the panic button. This alerts the amygdala as a threat, and our conductor sets off the fight, flight, or freeze alarm. When we experience early childhood experiences that are adverse in nature, it can turn into those books on the librarian's desk. Meaning, when you experience anything related to that book, whether directly or indirectly, your brain will not be able to differentiate between real adversity or perceived adversity, leading your alarm to go off when the adversity is perceived, amplifying emotions and dysregulating behaviors. If this happens too often, being unaware of our adverse books lingering on the librarian's desk, We manifest unhelpful stress responses, which perpetuates core negative beliefs and reactions. Working in the healthcare sector or in the sector of frontline and being first responders, counseling therapists, or any other frontline workers within our community exposes you to various stressors that may trigger your early experiences. The more adverse experiences you've navigated through life in your early years, like before the age of 18, the more likely those experiences would influence your ability to cope in stressful situations, putting you at higher risk of burnout, compassionate fatigue, and especially vicarious trauma. What happens in early childhood can matter for a lifetime. To successfully manage our society's future, we must recognize problems and address them before they get worse. In early childhood, major adversities such as extreme poverty, abuse, or neglect can weaken developing brain architecture and permanently set the body's stress response system on high alert. Science shows that providing stable, responsive, nurturing relationships in the earliest years of life can prevent and even reverse the damaging effects of early life stress, with lifelong benefits for learning, behavior, and health. Learning how to cope with adversity is an important part of healthy child development. When we are threatened, our body activates a variety of physiological responses, including increases in heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones such as cortisol. As frontline workers, we encounter stressful situations on perhaps a daily basis or beyond the norm of those who may not work in the front lines. It can become helpful to identify if perhaps you yourself would benefit from recognizing how your early childhood experiences play a role in whether you are capable of buffering your stress or if your stress response is constantly on high alert. So I would like for each of you to open the Adverse Childhood Experience screening link. So I did put that link into the chat box before we started this presentation. And I'd like for us to be able to go through the questions together. And at that time, you can either respond through the anonymous questionnaire, or you can kind of just keep track as I go through those different statements. So these statements is based on a research that took place about 30 years ago. And it was really an experience of looking at the correlations between early experiences in childhood as it relates to the way that we deal with stress responses in our adulthood, as much as also the connections that may be in consideration to other chronic illnesses and disorders, or even becoming risk factors as frontline workers when we work in really high stress environments. So the following questions are really based upon before the age of 18. Some questions can really be triggering, so just as a warning, but part of this experience is really of being able to have a better understanding of how our own experiences can really play a role in our risk factors into burnout, secondary trauma, as well as vicarious trauma and compassionate fatigue. So at any point since you were born and before the age of 18, has your parents or guardians ever been separated or divorced? Or perhaps you lived in a household where a member served time in jail or prison. Maybe you lived with a household member who was depressed, mentally ill, or committed suicide. That perhaps you saw or heard household members hurt or threaten to hurt each other, whether it is by physical or it could be verbal or psychological. Perhaps a household member swore at, insulted, humiliated, or put you down in a way that scared you. Perhaps someone touched your private parts or asked you to touch their private parts in a sexual way that was unwanted and made you feel afraid and uncomfortable. More than once, you went without food, clothing, a place to live, or had no one to protect you. If ever someone pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, or you were hit so hard that you were injured or had marks. Have you ever lived with someone who had a problem with drinking or using drugs? Or if you often felt unsupported, unloved, or unprotected. So out of those 10, if you can really reflect upon how many of those 10s that perhaps you've experienced before the age of 18. Research shows that if we've experienced 3 or more, we can become at risk of various different types of dysregulation of our stress response, as well as putting ourselves in at-risk factors for other symptoms such as chronic illnesses. It could be from IBS to anxieties to depression, some forms of MS, some forms as well as chronic pains, autoimmune system diseases, and the list goes on and on, included within the mental health realm. So section 2, at any point since you were born and before the age of 18, you've been in foster care. You've experienced harassment or bullying at school. You've lived with a parent or guardian who died. You've been separated from your primary caregiver through deportation or immigration. You have had a serious medical procedure or life-threatening illness, whether it is perceived or real. You have often seen or heard violence in the neighborhood or in your school neighborhood. You have been detained, arrested, or incarcerated. You have often been treated badly because of your race, sexual orientation, place of birth, disability, or religion. Or you have experienced verbal or physical abuse or threats from a romantic partner. So once again, from 0 to 9, how many of those that perhaps you've experienced? Being conscious of our ACE score can help us be mindful and compassionate towards our responses. Here are the collective responses to the ACE screening. So for those of you who've responded, I really appreciate it. I'm just going to be looking specifically at the overall. So out of the responses that we received, we had 14% that scored 0 in the first section. We had 20%, and it keeps coming in, so 20% that scored 1, 6% that scored 2, 17% that scored 3, 0 that scored 4, 13% that scored 5, 3% that scored 6, 13% who scored 7, 3% scored 8, 9, and 10. So it shows that regardless of our background and regardless of our abilities, our resiliency factors, our upbringing, very much that childhood adversities do not discriminate based on our backgrounds or based on our status, our race, etc. That for the majority of us and for most of us, the reasons that we do work in the front line or that we do work in this type of environment is perhaps because of something personal for us, or that we've had this value and this passion of wanting to contribute back to our community. But that also plays into that idea that we too can have risk factors that can definitely have an impact. So it's important to distinguish amongst 3 kinds of responses to stress: positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. These 3 terms refer to the stress response system's effects on the body, not to the stressful event or the experience itself. So positive stress response is a normal, essential part of healthy development. It really is characterized by brief increases in heart rate and mild elevations in hormone levels. So those are the circumstances where we may feel a bit stressed, getting ready to present in front of a large crowd, or doing something new, like riding a bike, or perhaps applying for a job, and etc. So those are the positive types of stress response, because once we've accomplished that, we've really been able to build better resilience around that, building new skills and opening new opportunities for ourselves. Then there's tolerable stress response, and that activates the body's alert system. So we talked about the amygdala, we talked about that conductor piece. So that alerts the system to a greater degree as a result of more severe and longer lasting difficulties, such as the loss of a loved one, a natural disaster, or a frightening injury. But with an environment that is supportive, we can overcome those types of stress responses, and it doesn't necessarily become toxic. Toxic stress response can occur when a person experiences strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity, such as physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, substance abuse, or mental illnesses, or exposure to violence, and or the accumulated burdens of family economic hardship without adequate healthy supports. This kind of prolonged activation of the stress response system can disrupt the development of brain architecture and other organ systems, and it increases the risk of stress-related disease and cognitive impairment. So our early childhood experiences, once again, can really play a risk factor in our adult. And once we are in our adult phase and we do experience toxic stress, at times it will have less of a detrimental impact that it has than it would on a child, because the child's system and brain architecture is being created in that moment. While within our adult lives, our brain structure usually matures around the age of 25, that prefrontal cortex. So the situation where our brains would either restructure or be rewired would probably be less likely during an adult than it would be during childhood. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we wouldn't be transforming or having an injury, in the sense that we now have different types of beliefs, and we'll talk about that later. So what is defined as trauma? So Dr. van der Kolk, back in the 1989, defined trauma as traumatization which occurs when both internal, so our coping strategies, and external, our environment, resources are inadequate to cope with external threats. So trauma itself can be conceptualized as the interaction between, as well as overlapping of multiple continua. So single incident trauma to multiple traumas, circumstantial to relational, childhood to adulthood. As a frontline worker, single incident, circumstantial trauma will have the least impact on your work. However, multiple relational traumas from childhood through to adulthood will have most of the impact on your work. Bottom line is, you are consciously aware of your role as a frontline worker. So most, if not all of us, are in this line of work because we want to make a difference. Therefore, our resilience to adversities is probably a bit higher than the general public. This does not make us immune. It simply makes us more tolerable to adversities, to which more interpersonal and chronic exposure would have the most impact on us versus single incidents. Single incidents may still have an impact and present a secondary trauma, and we'll talk about that later. But most probable in this field of work, and with the awareness that we all have as frontline workers, the exposure would most likely be of chronic exposure and interpersonal that would have the biggest impact on us. It is recognized that working with survivors of trauma carries impacts for workers. Unfortunately, within our communities, most systems on the front line do not screen for trauma or may not be a trauma-informed organization, creating a significant gap of awareness between the risk of workers to the development of vicarious trauma. A simple tool that could bring about significant awareness and opportunities for preventative measures would be the ACE screening that you've all participated in. Vicarious trauma is the impact on a worker after exposure to trauma work with clients, and it reflects the impacts and the changes or transformations of the worker over time. Signs and symptoms can be used to identify someone who may be suffering from vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. They're not diagnostic, but they can help in flagging a concern. They can lead to deeper reflection, exploration, and or referral to a practitioner. Other signs and symptoms may also relate to early on challenges that, if addressed timely, could play as a buffer to more serious symptoms down the road. So let's take a deeper look at the various forms of impact frontline workers may experience in their line of work. So we're going to be exploring burnout, countertransference, compassionate fatigue or secondary trauma, and then vicarious trauma. So burnout is a syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment that can occur among individuals who work with people in some capacity. Burnout is usually the result of prolonged stress or frustration, resulting in exhaustion of physical strength, emotional strength, and or motivation. So something that's really important to note about burnout is that it's not always due to the exhaustion of having too much on your plate, but it could also be a symptom of having not enough and not being challenged enough. So having those frustrations. Burnout tends to be associated with the workplace and is often a predictable outcome when the work environment demands a great deal from the workers or doesn't provide the opportunity for that worker to really explore and exercise to their fullest potential. One of the characteristics of burnout is that it occurs over a fairly long period of time and is cumulative. It doesn't afflict a person after one bad day. So as you expend energy throughout the day, like a car and its tank or battery, depending what kind of car you have, the energy is drained from that tank. Through breaks, lunch, laughter, feeling good about your work, receiving compliments, and so forth, your battery or your tank is recharged and you can continue to function well. What would happen if there was not enough positive input from work and from life outside of work to recharge your battery or your tank? Countertransference. Frontline worker response is influenced by their own unresolved issues. So that could be lingering impact of the frontline workers' victimization experiences, such as adverse childhood experiences and other types of experiences that we may experience throughout our lifetime that perhaps we haven't had an opportunity or an awareness to resolve those griefs, those unresolved griefs or issues. This may lead to avoidance and over-identification with the client or the individual that we're supporting. You may take on a protective role for the client or the individual, becoming either the champion of the client and adopt a role of rescuer. Countertransference occurs when a frontline worker relates to the client or the individual in a manner that replicates an existing relationship. Often, but not always, it tends to be a child-parent relationship. While vicarious trauma can be associated with countertransference, it's not the same. In many life circumstances, we may find ourselves in transference or countertransference situations. So in other words, this is a really natural phenomenon. As human beings and as mammals and as we are social creatures, countertransference and transference does happen on a regular basis. When we feel that gut feeling about a particular person and then all of a sudden we start developing a friendship with that person, or we feel that we can relate to those individuals, those are those instances of transference or of countertransference where we really connect with that individual. So again, that is a natural occurrence, but we're taking this context into as frontline workers and when we are in that frontline worker and client individual relationship. A client and individual may respond to you as if you are their sister who died, or their mother who was abusive. Or you may find yourself strangely connected to a young mother who you feel great sympathy for, but you are not sure why. Later, you reflect on how similar this client or this individual is to your younger sister. We are all subject, as I mentioned before, to this phenomenon. It's usually at work at the unconscious level. So earlier we talked about that 5 to 10%. Countertransference and transference occurs at that 90%. If left unattended, it can be harmful to the helping relationship, since the helping relationship needs to be based upon the client and individual in the context of who they are and what they need, right? versus what we think or how we are interpreting it because we are experiencing that countertransference. So compassionate fatigue or secondary trauma. Secondary trauma or compassionate fatigue occurs when a frontline worker relates to someone who has undergone a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events to the extent that they begin to experience similar symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that the trauma victim is experiencing. Compassionate fatigue is also in relation to a frontline worker relating to someone who has undergone overwhelming experiences that may not be traumatic in nature as well. In secondary trauma, the traumatizing event experienced by a client or individual becomes a traumatizing event for the frontline worker. The difference between secondary trauma and vicarious trauma is that secondary trauma can happen suddenly in one session, while vicarious trauma is a response to an accumulation of exposure to the pain of others. Vicarious trauma is a state experienced by those helping people in distress. Let's face it, right now, we are going through a collective trauma and we're dealing with a lot of individuals that have the unknown, that it's unpredictable, and we are sort of kind of just going with the flow of things. And to be honest, as human beings, we're uncomfortable with the unknown. And I think that that's a really common response for humans because we like certainty, we like predictability, and we like to be able to fix things. So in this current pandemic that we're experiencing, we are doing the best that we can, but at the same time, we are creating instances of what we call moral injury. So we're really fighting with ourselves between this idea of our role as frontline workers and as healthcare professionals versus our personal needs for safety and the safety of those that we love. So when we're talking about vicarious trauma, we are dealing and helping with people that are in distress in various magnitudes, including perhaps our coworkers, our colleagues, and also ourselves. So vicarious trauma is an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped to the degree that it can be traumatizing for the helper. Although there are some parallels to burnout, including symptoms such as exhaustion, feeling overwhelmed, isolated, and disconnected, vicarious trauma is much more pervasive, impacting all facets of life, including the body, the mind, the character, and our belief systems. The relationship of the person suffering from vicarious trauma to the world around them becomes altered. Like burnout, vicarious trauma typically develops over a period of time, after many sessions of listening to painful experiences with an empathetic listener. The issue is not whether or not workers experience vicarious trauma. The issue is how aware we are and how active we are in dealing with and attending to these issues. If experiences of vicarious trauma are not dealt with well or at all, negative impacts can overwhelming and be detrimental to the worker's quality of life. Vicarious trauma occurs when an individual develops trauma symptoms as a result of continuously working with traumatized people. This pandemic is a collective trauma. So if you are working with people, people are exhibiting traumatic stress responses, okay? So this current pandemic, as I mentioned, is a collective trauma, okay? So for all individuals, whether impacted directly or indirectly due to its intersectional implications globally. So some people are not impacted directly, but perhaps because of the daycares and the schools being closed and all those things, or economic-wise, or businesses are closed, or social distancing, we are being impacting in different spectrums in different various situations. So the intersectionality, so the uniqueness of each layer that's associated to this experience. So vicarious trauma is a normal and natural part of trauma work and is not a sign of individual deficiency. Symptoms of vicarious trauma can appear like post-traumatic stress disorder, but also encompasses changes in our perception of identity, sense of safety, or ability to trust, our self-esteem, our intimacy, and our sense of control. Vicarious trauma is the process of change that happens because you care about other people who have been hurt and you feel committed or responsible to help them. Over time, this process can lead to changes in our psychological, physical, and spiritual well-being. A range of behaviors and symptoms are associated with stress, burnout, vicarious, or secondary trauma. Unfortunately, there's not a specific set of behaviors and symptoms that automatically signal a diagnosis of burnout, vicarious, or secondary trauma. Each person is unique and their experiences is unique. Therefore, it's subjective. One person may experience sleep issues while the next is able to sleep well, but has headaches and recurring images or flashbacks. There are almost always several symptoms. If only one symptom is present, burnout, vicarious, or secondary trauma is not likely to be the cause. A red flag for vicarious or secondary trauma is the impact on the individual's worldview. Vicarious or secondary trauma changes the way you think about the world and yourself. Symptoms associated with this include feelings of being helpless, hopeless, and or powerless, feelings of lack of safety, trust, alienation from others, shattered assumptions about basic beliefs about life or people. These symptoms of vicarious or secondary trauma are the same as those of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a foundation of understanding vicarious or secondary trauma. You work in a challenging environment when you work within the front line, helping others. You're constantly in a stressful work environment. Your work environment is designed to engage with our most injured people within our communities, not the healthy people. Injured people are exposed to unavoidable triggers, lack of safety, whether it be caused by poverty, a lack of ability, or many experience adversities, invasive, at times loud and overwhelming emotions, such as fight, flight, or freeze, hypervigilance, fear of the unknown, lack of control, significant or complicated grief, perhaps loss of childhood, loss of identity, loss of control, pessimistic or concerned of the future. So who is at risk? The simple and perhaps most concerning answer is everyone. At the same time, we know that the same stressful or traumatic experience may impact one person deeply, but not another. Just like smoking increases the risk of developing cancer, eating animal products can increase chances of chronic illnesses and diseases, but not everyone who smokes or eats animal products will get cancer. Similarly, although we may all be at risk of burnout, vicarious or secondary trauma, not all of us will experience it at the same spectrum. So our individual risk factors are our personality and coping style. If we have a personality based on our current life circumstances or past current life circumstances that create this personality where perhaps we are more caregivers and we lack that self-compassion and we just work, and we don't necessarily are mindful about taking that time for ourselves. Or perhaps our coping styles are more around the idea of comfort that ranges more around the lines of isolation or avoidance or numbing, right? What about our current life circumstances? If financially that things are strained, or perhaps that our interpersonal relationship or intimate relationships are struggling, what kind of social supports do we have? What type of spiritual connection, whether it be by meditation or by yoga or other types of spiritual connections and resources within our community, if we follow a religion or practice a religion? Our work style, are we workaholics? Do we know our work-life balance? Are we working too much, too little? And again, that personal history. Not only our personal history in terms of our adverse experiences or our childhood experiences, but for those of you that may be racialized individuals or maybe marginalized individuals, there is also the generational history there, from Indigenous individuals to African Americans to other types of racialized individuals, to even certain cultures such as Jewish descendants and etc. So those histories do also play a significant impact within our genes. Our work risk factors. What is our role at work? Are we in a role that is very clearly defined, right? Or are we sort of in all other tasks? How is our work setting and our exposure within our work? How about our work conditions? Do we have the appropriate resources, materials, safety gear? What about our agency support? Do we work for a massive organization that by the time that the message gets there, it's months and months and months? Or do we work in a smaller agency where we have more of that communication? And what about the affected population responses and those reactions? What are the types of people that we do serve within our work environment? So these all become risk factors. And finally, your community risk factors. What is the predominant culture that surrounds us? What is the culture around talking about mental health or talking about advocating for services and resources? How are resources at large allocated? Do we have enough resources? Or is there a lack of resources, such as access to mental health care or access to health care? And other various community factors. What is our violence rate, right? What is our poverty rate? And all these different socioeconomic factors. So that was really brief. So that marks the end of our first mini webinar. I really wanted to take an opportunity for us to engage in any discussions. If there are any questions, it has been a great pleasure to share our knowledge in this first part of the Vicarious Trauma webinar. I really hope that you've had an opportunity to learn some new insights, or this has helped ponder further reflections. We are going to be hosting the second part of this webinar on May 6th at 7 p.m. So right now I'm going to be taking off the screen share and popping back up my video. And I'd like for us to have a discussions on your thoughts, any questions that came up for you, and any further explanation that you may want from me on the topic of vicarious trauma, trauma in general, or any other mental health concerns. For those of you that kind of feel like, okay, that's been enough, I hope you have a mindful evening, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. So for those of you that want to stay, just bear with me. I'm just going to stop the share and bring up my video so we can have a conversation. So one of the questions are if there are any websites available for resources that can be helpful, or any support groups available. So for now, what I can do is, for those of you that might be interested, I can always send some resources that are available. There is a variety of different websites, but sometimes we need to be careful with that, because sometimes it can become really overwhelming of having all of that information and not necessarily knowing how to navigate it. So I'm more than happy to provide some resources that I find really helpful, that I use with clients, but also that I use with my team to make sure that we ourselves, knowingly that we work within the industry of trauma, of being able to continue to promote vicarious resilience. And also next week, we're going to be talking about those resources. So today was really about the psychoeducation around that presentation about vicarious trauma. But next week, we're really going to be talking about different resources, different tools, some acronyms, and all around sort of that self-care and what you can do to help navigate and to try to buffer any instances of vicarious trauma. So are there any tools to help make the interpretation of your screen tool results? There is, so I can also send that. It is called ACEs Too High, but again, I can, perhaps what I can do is I can perhaps send that to our CMHA staff, or I think it's the other way around. If you have any questions or would like any resources, you can email CMHA and they will connect with me and I can send those links. But there is a link that interpretates the scores. and it sort of talks all about what the ACE study is and etc. I've also created a brochure on the ACEs because I find that it's really important to provide that information and education to clients as well as colleagues and students that I supervise as well. So it's sort of bringing all that complex information into one. So that I'm more than happy to share as well. And you can email at moncton@cmhanb.ca and make that request. And Jordan or whoever is going to be on schedule will be happy to send that information to me. Okay, so my question is how we approach an employer when we recognize burnout, and how can we explain vicarious trauma in a way that does not affect our work? So for example, working as a frontline with many clients who have high levels of trauma, how do you explain to your employer that you're struggling with that? So I think that part of this conversation is, of course, of you self-advocating for yourself. But I think that there needs to be more conversation about this idea of vicarious trauma. A lot of instances we tend to, when we identify it as being post-traumatic stress disorder, it really insinuates that that's the problem of the individual. But when we start changing the dialogue and we start articulating with using the right term, which is vicarious trauma, which is essentially asking the question, would I have experienced this type of traumatization if it were not for the role that I work in my work, right? So it almost becomes this ethical responsibility the same way as an electrician. We know that as electricians, we're going to be at risk of perhaps electrocution. So there is sort of that responsibility as an employer and as an organization to provide resources as preventive factors. So perhaps having safety gloves, right? So in our circumstances, vicarious trauma is very real. So there needs to be further conversations around, as an organization, around what are different policies and procedures that can be put in place that recognize these risk factors. That is part of your job, that you are going to become at risk of that. So in some ways, having that conversation about not necessarily pointing the finger and saying to the employer, you are responsible for this, but having really that collective responsibility in that. Different ways to communicate can be through assertive communication, as well as just finding different ways to being able to use the I statements and things like that. But at the end of the day, you can do as much as you can, but if the employer is not receptive to that kind of conversation or kind of passes the buck, then it can make it really difficult. So I think that one person alone can't necessarily make that significant change depending on the type of agency that you work with, but it needs to be a collective approach of really a system change in some ways. So the more of these types of webinars that happen, I know that personally with Breelove, we do offer organizational trainings, and we do offer different trainings to different associations and stuff to really bring that conversation and to somehow also advocate for the employees to give the science behind it and to give it a clinical approach that this does exist and this is part of the risk factors in someone's role within work. And in terms of burnout, we're going to be talking about that next week, but part of burnout as well, some of those best treatments is to take time off, right? It's really about that your tank is empty. So it's really about taking that step back and really reflecting on, what are things that I can do for self-care? We're going to explore that next week, the self-comfort versus self-care. When it comes to vicarious trauma, that treatment is very much similar to treatment that would be through post-traumatic stress. So it is about seeking therapeutic care. Reaching out to a licensed counseling therapist and reaching out to individuals that specialize in trauma. Just as a shout out as well, everyone has access to our community counseling program through CMHA, right? So this is happening on a weekly basis from Tuesday to Thursday, and it is free. And you kind of I think that Jordan can perhaps put the email to Diana in our message thing here, and you simply just reach out asking for an appointment, and you're going to get an appointment with an individual. All of our sort of team is trauma informed, so we do come from a trauma and base perspective. It is 45 minutes, but then at the end of that, we can provide some resources, and we can also refer for further therapy if it is beneficial. So that is another resource that can really be helpful during this time, and even after this pandemic that continues, because this is a program that we've always had available to our community, and will maintain to supporting New Brunswick as well. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. Sometimes I can kind of go around. It is a loaded question because it is much more complex than just a straightforward answer, but hopefully that answered it. So one question here, should people who work with people having experienced trauma be screened regularly, or should the screening for vicarious trauma be done only if there are signs? I think that there are two options here. So if you're a trauma-informed organization, it's embedded within your policies and processes that there is some form of sort of being proactive about it. So there are different implementations within the organization that allows to kind of check in, but it's not like intentionally checking in for vicarious trauma. Of course, the better relationship you have with yourself, the better that you know when things are not necessarily going based on your norm, right? So it's really about reflective practice and checking in with yourself. It's also part of sort of that investment. So if you know that that's the type of work that you do, and that is a risk factor, and that there is value to the work that you do, but most importantly, that you have a relationship with yourself where you have a sense of self-worth and that you matter, you're going to want to put those things into place in order to be able to better buffer these circumstances and better manage, so you have a better quality of life. So very much just like airplanes, you put the oxygen mask before you assist other people, right? So part of that is also in the realms of vicarious trauma. So if the question is about screening regularly, like individuals or as employees, so individuals, yes, I would always encourage, but I'm biased because I'm a traumatologist, I would encourage all organizations to screen through the ACEs, and that would probably give a lot of better insights of what type of individual that you're dealing with. So again, next week, we're really going to be talking about the different things that individuals can put in place in order to simply just take that responsibility of being proactive about it. We're not really going to have the conversation of what organizations can do. We do have trainings for organizations, but this is very much for the individuals. So I hope that answers that question there. So I'm just going to swap here. There's a question here. So we have a really good EAP program. Is this considered a tool that an employer is providing to help avoid burnout? So I think that is a really good point there, Mary, that EAP programs can be sort of those preventative or those triage opportunities. So absolutely that, seeking those programs can really help to buffer or to help mitigate or minimize the impact that burnout and secondary trauma and vicarious trauma can occur. Depending on the EAP program though, and I think that I need to really be specific about this, is that when we're dealing with vicarious trauma or we're dealing with trauma, you need to be able to have a practitioner that either specializes in it or is familiar and has practice in that realm, because trauma is a completely different ball game as general mental health or just the simplicity compared to trauma of burnout, right? So sometimes if we do go to individuals that may not have the awareness of trauma or may not be trauma informed, it can actually just create more complications, because there can be a misinterpretation that, what's wrong with me and I can't be fixed, or also sort of that frustration towards the therapist of not being able to provide that help. So there are EAP programs that do offer trauma units. So it's really important to very much consider asking those questions as well, because I've had conversations with employers before where asking the question of, do the EAP programs offer trauma informed, and they were not as certain on that. So hopefully that answers that comment of that statement. So as an employer, how do I mitigate vicarious trauma or secondary trauma and ensure my team is taken care of? So that's a really good question. So part of that, again, is about perhaps relooking at what type of policies and procedures that are in place. So what kind of supports are there for the team? And I find that it can be always helpful, if you want to be proactive, of having annual trainings associated to trauma, just to keep people refreshed in just as reminders of what are things that are risk factors, and really sort of bringing that to the forefront or into our consciousness. Sometimes it's great when we do have trainings and stuff, but oftentimes we kind of leave those trainings and then we kind of forget what we learned about. We're all excited, we're all gung-ho, and then that kind of it ends there. So next week, we are going to be talking about that, but being able to implement self-care plans can be really helpful in those circumstances, and really having an employer that has sort of that open dialogue and that transparency of conversation, of not, ignoring the elephant in the room, but having those tough conversations and having debriefs, right? So debriefs are extremely important, and perhaps having certain programs that are in place to, feel good check-ins. So opportunities for individuals to do something other than just talk about, those traumatic experiences, of kind of cleaning the air and having those opportunities for people to tap into the other senses. Because one thing that is important to note, and we talked about that when we talked about how we process experiences, is that a lot of these experiences happen at the hippocampus, or in the middle part of our brains, right? And that's the nonverbal part of the brain. So that means that a lot of our grounding techniques would be much more beneficial if we are looking at the 5 senses, such as touch, feel, sight, hearing, and taste. So the more that you're doing things that are really touching on those nonverbal and those I guess those types of senses, can really have a significant impact. So doing things as a team, like I know with CMHA a couple of times we've done food tests, right, where we were getting the opportunity to taste different types of foods and coming together and having those discussions around that. You're really making that effort to be mindful and in that present moment, but it can help to kind of take away from that stressful environment that's outside, that is waiting at our desk and stuff. So doing different things that bring people together in that connectiveness. I realize that it can be really challenging in this moment, because we are in this pandemic and trying to explore that social distancing. One thing that I find that is helpful, and we've implemented that as a team, is bi-weekly we do have feel-good check-ins, where we do check in as part of a video all together, and we ask each other gratitude questions about what is the one thing that we are proud of for that week, or what is that one funny thing. So to just bring in more of that positiveness. But if you do have further questions about what can you do as an employer, do reach out to CMHA and connect with me. I do have some resources and different things that might be helpful as well. So I hope that answers that particular question. So is there a chance that the screening will be the precipitator of vicarious trauma? So Krista, do you mean, like, is it going to trigger it? The screening itself will definitely be able to identify if there are risk factors, right? So part of sort of that screening, as I mentioned before, if individuals score a 3 and up, then the risk become higher and higher and higher. So the risk of, let's say that if through that screening we recognize, wow, I never really realized that these significant things are actually adversities, then that could significantly play a role in not being aware, right? Oftentimes, the circumstances of us going into that vicarious trauma is because we are unaware, right? We're unaware that the symptoms or the behaviors or the feelings that we have are associated to vicarious trauma. We often think, because we're frontline workers, that, it's part of my job and that's what I do. And, I help vulnerable people, or I'm always in, those really high stress situations. So when we start tolerating those adversities without being aware of the consequences to it, then that's what puts us at risk. But of course, those screenings can really help to at least begin to paint a picture of what kind of risk factors do I have that could lead me down the road of vicarious trauma. So I know for myself, I do have a high score. So part of my experiences, as well as being a traumatologist, is about very much being mindful of that and making sure that I implement certain things in place in order to not try to avoid vicarious trauma, but to better understand the circumstances that may lead me down that path, and being able to make certain choices and behaviors that will help to mitigate it so that the impact isn't as detrimental or as impactful, but very much so of how can I transform vicarious trauma. And we're going to, again, talk about that next week in terms of what happens when we do have it and how can we transform that. So what would you recommend for someone, a worker who is not getting support within their own organization? So debriefing, opportunities, insights. So that's a really good question, because at the end of the day, we can only do so much, right? If our organization is not receptive to it, or whether it's because the organization is too large or unaware or disorganized, or they're dealing with their own issues and stuff like that, it can make it very, very challenging for employees. So things that I do suggest is that sometimes it can be really helpful to look externally, right? So seeking supervision external to your organization. I know that at least in the therapy world, we do that on a regular basis. Like it's part of our licensing, but it's also part of sort of that type of support. So it doesn't necessarily need to be someone that is in the same role as you. You could seek that type of debriefing opportunity or insight from a therapist, from a psychologist, or you can also consider looking at peer, right? Peer support. So if you are more than one individual within that organization that seems to be seeing that issue, of collectively coming together and creating a informal or also formal peer support group where you can help each other by debriefing and all those things, because all of you are sort of in that same situation and can probably relate as well to a lot of the circumstances. I do know that if you do choose to go externally, and depending on the circumstances, probably for most of you, you do deal with confidentiality, of just making sure that you do get the confidentiality agreement signed and all those things. But if you do seek that type of work through therapy, that's going to be inevitable that you are going to be signing a confidentiality agreement. So I hope that sort of answers that question as well. So I'm just going to skip here and just check. Okay, awesome. So do you have support as a team for your workers working with trauma? We do have any support at our workplace for workers. How can we get this support? So that's a really good question. I guess, again, I'm going to be biased because I'm a traumatologist, but I know that with Breelove Counselling, we do offer supports. We work within the community as well with private sector in order to provide that type of information. I do also believe that EAP organizations and programs do offer different types of supports around that for the workplace for workers. But right now, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that there are any other organizations that do provide trauma-informed training or psychoeducation around that. So yeah, so if that is of interest, you can always reach out to CMHA. I know that CMHA offers tremendous different types of trainings and services and programs that are related to mental health. We are significantly, we are partnered with CMHA, so if there are ever any requests that CMHA themselves are not able to offer, they do always look at their partners to see if there is an opportunity for partnership as well. We've done that in the past where we've applied for grants, and we've been able to provide various different types of supports, or even developing those services and those programs integrated within the workplace, so that when we remove ourselves, that agency or that organization can continue doing that work and supporting those individuals that are working with the traumatized population, but most importantly, how to support the workers that are working with individuals that experience trauma. So I hope that answers that question as well. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so Krista, going back to the question of, yeah, absolutely. The A screening oftentimes can trigger. It wouldn't necessarily trigger vicarious trauma so much. Like, it may be like the tipping of the iceberg, because again, vicarious trauma is an accumulative, right? But it could potentially trigger secondary trauma, in the sense that perhaps that person has so much underlying situations that they have not dealt with, sort of that bottleneck effect, or they just kept everything bottled in so much that at one point, yeah, going through and reading through pretty raw and vulnerable questions like that could be that tip of the iceberg, and they could start experiencing those things. I think one thing that's really important to recognize as well is that when you are providing that type of A screening, and mind me, like when we did it through this webinar, we are all professionals, but I also understand that it could have been also triggering. But oftentimes when we do offer that A screening, we have this built either therapeutic relationship, or at least this built sense of trust and safety before we kind of throw that into sort of getting someone to fill that out. So by any means, I think that it's really important to have a conversation before, or at least have something that is under the lines of explaining what the process is, and to explain sort of that forewarning that these things can be triggering. So it's really important that the person that's going to be receiving it knows that, you know, you're going to debrief with them afterwards, right? Oftentimes I do the A screening with the individual as well. That can be really helpful to kind of buffer any instances of triggers. So I hope that answers my question. Sorry, my headpiece keeps coming out of my ear. Will debriefing with a supervisor following stressful interactions with clients reduce the development of burnout for all, or does it vary by person? Absolutely, that's another really good question. So it can, but oftentimes too, sometimes debriefing, it really depends on what kind of conversation you're going to have with your supervisor. So if you're going to, you know, debrief with your supervisor about these stressful interactions, and you're not necessarily getting that validation, or your supervisor themselves are feeling uncomfortable or do not have that capacity, and they kind of avoid the subject, or they you know, that they avoid the subject, or they're perhaps not going more into detail to provide that support, it could just continue to contribute to those aspects of burnout. But absolutely, I think that it's really super imperative that people debrief after stressful situations and not keep it to themselves. No matter, even if that thought process is, you know, it's an everyday thing, regardless of the circumstances, right? Because experiences are subjective. So just because that perhaps you feel that it's not a big deal, better safe than sorry, right? And if that resource is available, why not utilize that? That's a way of being proactive and really being able to be part of buffering it, but also increasing your protective factors. So again, it really depends on the interaction. I've had circumstances where individuals would have debriefed with their supervisors, and it just made things worse because they just felt like, well, why did I even share this, or etc. Right? And also keeping in mind that at the end of the day, we're all human beings. So supervisors as well should have someone that they can debrief with. That their role is not necessarily of always just taking that in, but they also have to, they need to have an avenue as well. So hopefully that also answers your question. So do you have any recommendations for screening tools that can be paired with ACEs? I'm curious, as our journal club just read Anda and Elle's article. So absolutely, there are other types of screening tools. So the ACEs is really universal. So whether you are a frontline worker or it is for clients, but there are other screening tools that are specific to healthcare professionals and frontline workers. So I know the question that you asked, but I'm just wondering, is it specifically that you're asking screening tools for clients or screening tools for staff and frontline workers? So I'll let you kind of let me know. So some other screening tools, I guess, that can be paired with ACEs is the global screening tool. So that screening tool allows you to be able to recognize other instances, whether there might be depression or anxiety or substance abuse or suicidal ideations and all those things. So that can also be paired with it. It could be for both, as the article talked about, strength, limitation, and misapplications of ACEs. Yeah, sure. So again, when you are applying ACEs, I always encourage people to either get a training on that screening or that they are familiar with that screening. So for us, I know that with Breelove Counselling, we do have a document that we are almost finished with that really explains the process of ACEs. And the hope is that we can then translate that into being able to provide these mini trainings, or whether it's a lunch and learn or whatnot, about how to use the ACE screening effectively. So you really do, Miranda, thank you so much. You make a really good point that, yeah, there are going to be misapplications, and part of those limitations as well are that sometimes people are going to misinterpret the statements that are there. I've had that numerous times where a client would perhaps score a 1, but further to the conversation we would have, all of a sudden now they're at 5. So there can be sort of those limitations where it does not necessarily take into other circumstances. So the ACE screening, for those of you that participated this evening, that is like the second version of the ACEs, because the original ACEs is based on the 10 first questions that you were asked. The other 9 is an updated version, because when they looked at the limitations of the ACEs, they were not taking in consideration external environments, right? That sometimes, you know, bullying can have an impact, and different experiences such as racism or social injustices and poverty or violence within the neighborhoods and et cetera can play a really strong role in all of those. So absolutely, there's going to be limitations, but for the most part, at least since we've implemented the ACEs for clients as well as even for ourselves, it has expedited our opportunity of really honing down to what is really the leading or the root cause of the individual's complaints, including ourselves, right? Of starting to make those connections and bettering understanding how our experiences can play a factor in our risk factors, and whether that we are susceptible to burnout and vicarious trauma, as well as secondary trauma. Okay, so I know that CMHA put their email in there if you had questions. I'm also going to just put my email there, just if there are any questions after that I close up. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating this evening. I really look forward to talking about the second part of this mini-series, when we really look at self-care, vicarious resiliency, the basics of how we can find ways to navigate through vicarious trauma and transform our experiences into one that can be helpful for the profession that we work in. So I hope that everyone is well. I guess happy Wednesday. And I will see you all next week. All right, take care. Bye.